Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm your host, Iqbal Sevea. In this podcast series, we dive deep into timely and key issues relating to South Asia. Throughout the series, I'm joined by scholars, policymakers, and practitioners who provide expert analysis of geopolitical, economic, and socio-political developments in South Asia. Wherever it is that you are joining us from, be it in the gym, on the train, while driving, or having a cup of chai, we hope you enjoy our South Asia chat. On the 1st of February, India's Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman presented the budget for 2026. Every time India's budget is revealed, it naturally attracts attention. This year, there is an additional impetus to examine the implications of the budget, as this budget comes at a point where India is negotiating its position in an evolving global geo-economic order and has finalized trade deals, most notably with the United States and the EU. The finance minister also premised her speech by stating that the budget is founded upon three kartavyas or duties: to accelerate and sustain economic growth amidst a volatile global dynamics, to fulfill the aspirations of the people, and to ensure universal access to states' resources. And as expected, the media is covering this issue extensively and sometimes dramatically. Several tags have been given to the budget. These include, and I quote, stability budget, a budget focusing on technology-driven growth, a budget that avoided populism, a kartavya budget, and a phrase that has been doing the rounds, a boring budget. And by the way, a boring budget is not necessarily a bad budget. Given all the chatter, noise, and rush for an immediate headline, it can be hard to get a sense of the implications of the budget. To provide a deeper insight into aspects of the union's budget and what it means, I'm joined by two eminent personalities who are all hands at teasing out the details behind the big statements and provide perspectives on key aspects of financial decisions and policy making. While the budget may have been described as boring, I assure you that my two guests are certainly not boring. I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Vinod Rai, former Comptroller and Auditor General of India, and currently Honorary Senior Fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, and Dr. Amitendu Palit, Senior Fellow and Head of the Trade and Economics Cluster at the Institute of South Asian Studies. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure, Iqbal. Thank you for having me on the show, and great to join you, Mr. Rai, as well.
Thank you very much, Iqbal. It's a pleasure to join this podcast.
The pleasure's all mine. Amitendu, can I start by asking you to contextualize this budget for us? Could you highlight what some of the broader geo-economic and geopolitical dimensions are that this budget is addressing?
Thank you, Iqbal. I would first like to point out that this is the budget for the fiscal year 2026-27 that we are looking at. So in a sense, if one looks at this third term of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, this would be a budget which one can safely say that this is the middlemost year for which the budget has been placed in the economy. Now, this, in a way, brings us to a situation where we need to step back and take a look at what has been happening in the world and also within India over the last 5 to 6 years. And we are halfway into the decade of the 2020s. So we have basically had 5 years of post-COVID existence, if I can describe it that way. I think for the government of India, this understanding has always been very critical that while it has retained this distinction of being the fastest growing among the G20 economies for a long time, there is no room for complacency on that regard. And growth has to be maintained at a level which is technically higher than most of that of the other G20 or major economies of the world, which is their median growth rate, which is roughly, I would say, at around 4 to 4.5%. India really cannot afford to grow by that rate because it needs to be very active in generating economic activity. It needs to maintain a certain level of aggregate demand in the economy, which would spur consumption and which would also at the same time be good enough to generate incomes across the country. So with that being the overall macroeconomic objective, the challenges that are arising for the economy is basically from the external sector. And as you mentioned, we live in a time of rather turbulent geopolitics, and the year 2025 has been exceptionally turbulent for not just India, but the rest of the world. And that is largely because of the relationship with the United States on trade, and also the complicated developments that have come around that relationship. India specifically faced very high tariffs, and it is only just after the budget that India and the US have agreed to reach a deal on the basis of which the tariffs of 50% will be cut down to 18%. But that does not take away the fact that this has created a lot of strategic anxiety within the country. It has also created a broader strategic anxiety among a lot of countries across the world, especially the American allies. And the result of that has been that there is a new look being taken at the different kinds of relationships, especially economic and trade and investment relationships that various countries are entering into. I think India, in that respect, has tried to basically look at two issues. One is to make sure that the impact of the external trade policies, which are mostly inimical, doesn't affect the domestic economy as much as it can otherwise. And so there are methods or means for protecting those. And the other thing that India has also been doing is also to look at opportunities that are coming out from the current context. So that leads to deeper relationships with a number of other economies of the world, including especially the European Union, in the Middle East, maybe with Canada, United Kingdom. And the long and short of all this has been that the objective to ensure domestic macroeconomic stability has been combined with a focus on how to make that stability aligned to a situation of external uncertainty. Now, this is where I would like to draw upon a submission which has been made by the current economic survey, the pre-budget economic survey. And this economic survey actually notes that India last year grew at around 6.5 to 7%. We will know the final number when the last estimates come out. And it did so with a fairly stable level of inflation, well within what the RBI projected it to be. But notwithstanding that, it wasn't really awarded by the global system with stable currency inflows and a stability in as far as the currency rate is concerned. Now, this makes one wonder, and in fact, it is the economic survey which points it out, that this makes one wonder that what more does an economy need to do other than ensuring macroeconomic stability to get the kind of positive response from the global system that you would have expected otherwise. I think this is a question which really lurked in the context of the budget when it went into preparation. And as a result of that, in the budget, we see an emphasis on multiple directions of continuing to develop self-reliance, develop new capacities. We can discuss many of those in details. But I think this is a trend which is now going to stay with the Indian budgets, because it's not just a question of having enough room within the domestic economy for managing the domestic conditions, but the budget also has to be prepared by keeping an eye on what is happening in the outside world and how that might impact the Indian economy. Because in a sense, India's economic vulnerabilities are larger than most of those in the rest of the world. The kind of population that it has, the challenges that it's facing from extreme weather incidents, and of course, a difficult politics in the neighborhood. So all these increase India's economic vulnerabilities. And I think in that respect, making of the budget is becoming more and more challenging as years progress.
And actually, that leads very quickly to an assessment of how do we see this budget and what pops up to us. And Mr. Rai, could I ask you to share your thoughts on how would you describe this budget? There are a number of quotations I provided earlier about how this budget is seen, how it's being described in the media. But how do you describe this budget, and what are some of the aspects that drew your attention?
Thank you, Iqbal. See, this budget, as you described it, as a very boring budget, very placid and didn't kind of invite excitement. See, what happens is presentation of the annual budget in India always generates a certain element of excitement, and this is more in the media than really on the ground because there is very limited flexibility that a finance minister has in an annual budget. There is so much of committed expenditure. There are so much competing demands on every rupee that the finance minister will be, collecting and spending, that it leaves very little margin. But why I call this people are calling it a boring budget is number one, I think the government has done very well, as you just mentioned, that they have eschewed populism and they have decided to remain on the glide path leading to a certain amount of fiscal deficit, which they want to maintain over a period of time, and they don't want to overspend so that there is stability in the economy, stability in terms of foreign investment. So they have chosen what I would call indications towards some growth orientation, balancing investment, and bringing about sustainability. And why I say this is, see, usually a budget would have certain amount of provisions for agriculture, for health, for education, for drinking water, for rural employment, issues and sectors which are very important for a diverse geography like India is. But this budget has given a certain direction. The provisions may be very small, but the directions, and that's why I called it strategic, is number one, that a tax holiday for cloud and data centers, which is not only a fiscal kind of a incentive, but a strategic incentive. The second is where India's semiconductor mission, which now wants to go into the 2.0 mode, and there are certain provisions in the budget which is encouraging that. The third, realizing the supply chain constraints that India faces going forward in technological issues, is a dedicated rare earth corridor designed to create a mine to magnet kind of an ecosystem, and that direction has been given by the finance minister in the current budget. The fourth, which I would like to draw your attention to, is, and because in the Glasgow COP meeting, India had declared that it will be net zero by 2070. Now, starting on that path, the finance minister has provided a certain amount of money for development of carbon utilization and storage facilities. Now, this will be a big technological essential to reduce the carbon footprint for India's critical industries. So obviously, some of our industries are and continue to be fossil based, but these are being introduced by the government to ensure long-term benefits accruing towards sustainability.
Thank you, Mr. Rai. You've actually raised a number of things that we need to discuss in this podcast as well. But before that, could I ask you to expand a little bit about on your thoughts about the need in this budget to reduce the deficit and control the debt? You wrote a piece for the Institute of South Asian Studies in which you highlighted that this budget focuses on reducing the deficit and controlling debt. How important are this, and do you think this will be sufficient to grapple with potential inflation?
I think it's designed to go in that direction because you will appreciate that government requires long-term investment in various technological as well as industrial sectors that they have been planning. Now, public capex has its own limitations. And if you read through the budget documents carefully, you will find that public spending on infrastructure in the previous year was not up to the budget estimates. It fell short of it. Now, that was largely because the tax buoyancy expected did not materialize. But however, government could maintain some of its expenditure by some tax revenues which were accruing to it. Now, at the same time, if the government has to control inflation, to control its fiscal deficit, these are the only ways that they can attract investment from outside. So, government in its effort to bring about a certain growth orientation and seek investments into critical industries, they have taken the path to ensure that they are not populist, they don't go in for freebies, and yet they control the fiscal deficit to present to the outside world an economy which is very stable, which is leading to a certain degree of consolidation, and where inflation will be kept under control. In fact, inflation is very much under control, and that's how the government has been managing. Uh, Invariably, what happens is that India has some or the other states going to polls every year. And this year we have two, three large states also going into polls. States like Tamil Nadu, states like West Bengal will be going to poll. But the government has been able to abjure, stay away from providing what I would call freebies, to not to put a very unreasonable demand on public spending. And to that extent, government has to be complemented so that they present a picture of stability, which will in turn attract investment from abroad. That's how I would look at it.
And that spurs another question in my mind, Mr. Rai. You rightly mentioned the need to spur investments from outside. If you were a foreign investor, what are some of the features of this budget that will appeal to you?
Well, what I would look at is number one, that do I have the necessary infrastructure to put in an investment of any kind? And to that extent, government has been putting in a great deal of funds into creating physical infrastructure. That's number one. Number two, how welcoming is the government in terms of ease of doing business to allow me to invest and take it forward? Now, that is why I call the investments or the incentives that the government has provided in the budget as being strategic and not only fiscal. So government is inviting industries to come set up data centers, come and participate in the semiconductor mission. And semiconductor mission, Tata, for example, has set up two missions, one in Gujarat and one in Assam. There is Micron also, which is doing it in Gujarat. Near the new airport that is being created in UP, the Jivar airport, there also Foxconn is setting up a huge semiconductor facility, and we are hopeful that this will be actual, not adding to the supply chain where India used to feel constraints earlier.
Before I turn to the semiconductor sphere, Amitendu, could I ask you to speak a little bit about the manufacturing sector? It's because the budget has clearly stressed the need to strengthen India's manufacturing sector, especially so with regard to 7 key sectors. These include semiconductors, electronics, and textiles, etc. There's also actually been a mention about the need to further development the skill sector as well, but let us focus a little bit on the manufacturing sector for now. How do you think the budget will spur the manufacturing sector? And overall, what does the budget do to expand India's GDP? Amitendu, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Iqbal. I think I'll just continue from the emphasis that Mr. Rai ended on, and which is basically the theme that as far as investments and allocation of public funds are concerned, it's not just, going head by and looking at drinking water or rural development or some specific industries, but funding to be allotted in a manner which is more strategic, and in the sense of that being strategic, creating capacities which can contribute to the long-term growth of certain industrial supply chains and ecosystems in India. And I think even from that perspective, if we come into the manufacturing story, there are quite a few which I think are important sectors to be looked at. The first is, of course, the semiconductors. We discussed briefly about that, and we can talk more later. I think on semiconductor, the ISM 2.0 is aiming to go into a second phase of evolution of indigenous and local capacities in this regard. So we can take a look at that. But there's also something else that I would like to flag, and this is in a sense connected to what we have seen for semiconductors. That is the rare earth corridors, which have been proposed in the budget in four mining-rich states of India: Tamil Nadu, Odisha, Andhra, and Kerala. Now, I think the semiconductors and the rare earths sit together quite nicely. And if there is a certain degree of purposeful strategic complementarity that can be pushed, they by themselves can create an excellent manufacturing ecosystem, which can not just feed into each other's perpetual expansion, but also perhaps down the line take care of the need for generating manufacturing exports from the country. Moving on forward from there, there are certain other connected areas. So, for example, you have the chemical hubs which have been proposed. Again, chemical hubs, I think, essentially would try to address the problem of India lacking sufficient capacities, domestic capacities, in a number of chemicals for which it is sort of dependent on the rest of the world. There are electronics manufacturing schemes, but there's something, Iqbal, which I think I need to point out at this stage. And before that, let me also mention that the budget has been continuing the effort to change what we typically call the inverted duty structure, where you have a system of maintaining duties in the economy where customs duties on imported inputs used by manufacturers are more than the final products insofar as their imports are concerned. And this has been a very pervasive way of structuring duty. But for the last 3 years, the budget has been wanting to correct that. And as a part of that effort, we see the basic customs duties coming out in a number of imports, including, for example, those for processing of seafood products, then in the leather, footwear, and shoe uppers, and in, say, for example, customs duties on specified parts that are used in making microwave ovens, aircraft manufacturing, defense products, and so on and so forth. So I think there are certain dedicated efforts to address the deficiencies in capacity that are existing in various parts of manufacturing supply chains. But the question over here is a bigger one. I think the budget, or for that matter, any federal policy or state policy, has a limitation to the extent that it can only declare the policy. Ultimately, on ground, the response has to come from the investors and industries who will create these capacities. Now, this is where perhaps we can, in the course of this discussion, come back to the question of whether, in spite of encouraging policies that the budget has announced this year, and what it has also in some cases announced in the previous years, in spite of these policies, shall we get to see a revival of private investments, long-term private investments, including long-term private foreign investments, and private capital expenditure in the economy? Do we see a possibility of those reviving? And that is something which I really want to have an opportunity to check out from Mr. Rai and you as we go forward in the conversation.
Certainly, that is something that I would like to get your thoughts on, both of your thoughts on as well. But Amitendu, you ended on a interesting note where you mentioned that we have to think about the industries that will create the growth as well. And in this sector, Mr. Rai, could I ask you to speak a little bit about the focus in this budget on the MSMEs? Now, the MSMEs, as we all know, are the micro, small, and medium enterprises. In this budget, there was a mention about the need to enable MSMEs to develop and expand. Now, just for contextual note for our listeners, MSMEs actually contribute slightly over 30% to India's GDP and make up almost 50% of India's exports. Yet they have been confronting challenges ranging from access to finance to tech adoption. Mr. Rai, how important and effective will the budgetary announcements be in helping the MSMEs?
Thank you, Iqbal. You've actually touched a critical area because besides adding to exports, the MSME is hugely important for India in terms of providing employment opportunities. And bulk of employment is offered by the MSME industries. They are spread all over the country, from region to region, and they require a certain degree of professional skilled workers, which we are not able to provide fully, but we are working in that direction to be able to provide it. Now, MSME were facing two kind of problems. One was access to finance, adequate amount of finance without leveraging very heavily. The other was certain infrastructural kind of limitations, which was largely power, maybe transportation, maybe logistics. In this budget, the government has given an indication to create a dedicated growth fund to create what they call MSME champions. So they are trying to highlight certain areas and certain areas where MSME would be incentivized to take up certain challenges. And because, as I mentioned earlier, these MSME industries are spread all over the country with the result that there are varied challenges as much as there are varied requirements for each of these. Now, the fund provides growth oriented capital, helping to professionalize without excessively leveraging their balance sheet to borrow money. And one of the encouraging things that the government has done is to encourage NBFCs, non-banking financial companies, to expand their lending to MSMEs. And there they have been passing it on to the Reserve Bank of India to frame policies to help them devise structures by which these MSME industries would have better, easier, and cheaper access to funds. Up till now, there was only the formal sector, which was the banking sector and others from whom they were able to access capital. But if NBFCs can also provide them capital, then the area of opportunity grows very substantially for these sectors, because again, government will have to be very mindful of the fact that it is this sector which provides employment opportunities.
Amitendu, before I come to the question that you had raised as well about how effective will these policies be, I just want to get to some other aspects of the budget. And one of the aspects which both Mr. Rai and yourself have alluded to is the fact that there's a mention in this budget about India Semiconductor Mission 2.0. And this indicates a transition from the current semiconductor mission to Mission 2.0. Now, this is an issue that, of course, is of grave importance in India, but also given the greater geopolitical competition over technology, has wider ramifications. But it also particularly has particular interest in Singapore because Singapore is also partnering with India in the semiconductor sector. Can I ask you, Amitendu, to clarify, does the Mission 2.0 signal a significant transition from what was previously done, and what can we expect from Mission 2.0?
Iqbal, the ISM 1.0 or the Indian Semiconductor Mission 1.0, as it is popularly referred to, was the beginning of, I would say, the first part of a strategy to develop a comprehensive semiconductor supply chain in India. And the result of that policy is in what we have seen in some of the examples that Mr. Rai mentioned. Domestic as well as foreign investments coming in the establishment of semiconductor assembling, testing, and packaging. By and large, that's the segment, assembling, testing, and packaging, which has got most investments in India. But along with that segment, there has also been a focus on development of designs, semiconductor designs and chips, and that is making use of the number of rather bright people that you have in India in this space of industrial design and engineering skills. Now, the interesting part is that if one looks at the semiconductor supply chain, the design part is at the topmost end of the chain, and the assembling part is at the lowermost end of the chain. In between, there's a huge part of the chain, which essentially is what we typically refer to as establishment of foundries, where we have enterprises from the world like the TSMC and others who have been really at the cutting edge of volume and scale in this regard. And that's where Taiwan's proficiency and those of even Korea's, Samsung's and other come in. What the ISM 2.0 is trying to do is to actually position the Indian semiconductor drive into the middle part of the supply chain as well. So the focus of this ISM 2.0 is on making capacities in India, which would ensure that India gets to have more of the equipment that is required for making semiconductor chips and make those equipment within the country, along with a focus on the capacity for raw materials that go into the making of semiconductors. Now, I'm not really making a one-to-one correlation in this regard, but I think it is pretty much obvious that when we look at announcements like the rare earth corridors and mining sectors that are coming up, the connection between how India is looking at the growth of its semiconductor ecosystem and the supply chain, as well as capacity and stability, or more specifically, domestic self-reliance in rare earth production and critical minerals production. The two are kind of going hand in hand. You mentioned Singapore in this regard, and I think down the line, Singapore is going to be a very important partner for India in its next 5 to 10 year of journey on expanding the semiconductor supply chain, much as I expect that partnership to be very robust with respect to Korea, with respect to Taiwan, with respect to the United States, and even Europe, which are at this point in time controlling various parts of the semiconductor design, making, fabrication making, the foundry making, equipment making, and eventually the assembly, testing, and packaging. So it's a step in the right direction. There is no denying it. But I think, Iqbal, we must accept the fact that building a semiconductor ecosystem, and that too comprehensively located within India, is a very tall task. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a lot of time. Semiconductor investments require very deep pockets. The advantage that India has is that it will be able to provide a market, a fast-growing market, which provides a ready-made demand for semiconductor chips, because everything requires chips today. So I think that is the sort of the lever which India is strategically using to build capacities internally, so much so that foreign investors are very enthused over the fact that this is a country other than China, which has developed internal capacities that can support the hosting of large parts of a semiconductor supply chain, and therefore putting their investments accordingly.
Actually, that very nicely leads to a discussion about the approach towards the tech sector more broadly, and the need to bolster domestic capacity with foreign investment as well. There was much mention in this budget about, or I should say, much mention on tech issues. And with regards to the tech sector, there was discussion about incentivizing AI, digital infrastructure, and even cloud sovereignty. And apart from emphasizing the need for an expansion of domestic capacity, the budget also proposed a tax holiday until 2047 for foreign companies in certain sectors. Mr. Rai, could I ask you to assess, provide a perspective of how you read the policy decisions with regards to tech and foreign investment, and how effective do you think these would be?
Iqbal, I would say that government has done well in trying to show a path, an indication, giving a guidance to industries like companies like Microsoft who would like to set up data centers in the country, because the tax holiday up to 2047 will be a fairly huge incentive for these cloud companies. And as I mentioned earlier, that the tax holiday is not merely a fiscal kind of an incentive, it is strategic because it provides a long term path to any of these industries. But of course, it comes with certain challenges because these industries are all capital intensive. They require huge amount of infrastructure, which I mentioned earlier would be power and water, cooling plants, and then a certain degree of regulator reforms also will be uh, called for, and that hopefully the government is planning side by side, because these industries will not come in as long as that those reforms don't set up. But I think the other challenge that the government would be facing in this direction, and I think that requires action immediately, is the development of skill which these industries would require, because that's where I think there is a certain degree of mismatch. And if we have to invite these industries to, or these companies to come and set up data centers in the country, we will have to ensure that the required quantities or numbers of skilled manpower or the human resource requirements of each of these companies would be fulfilled. And there, I think there is a certain gap which will have to be bridged. And that is where the government will have to provide in assurance to those wanting to set up these. And I think the pipeline there would be a minimum of 2 years. Government has to ensure that these skill development centers start churning out people, professionals who can be employed by these companies or industries.
Hmm. The sense I'm getting from both of you is that this is a budget that should be seen as one that is trying to develop and emphasize the need to develop domestic capacities in certain sectors, especially with regards to critical minerals, technology, to critical minerals and technology. But it's also one that is looking to spur foreign investment in India. And the issue of foreign investment, and I should expand it to say private investment rather, is something that the economic survey has raised, and even the previous economic survey had highlighted as well. Can I get your assessments? And I'll start with Amitendu, and then I'll come to you, Mr. Rai. Do you think I'm throwing your question back at you, Amitendu? Would this budget and the policies that have been proposed encourage private investment? And I should highlight, right, this is also a context in which foreign direct investment in India has been declining as well. So it's an important question to grapple with.
Iqbal, there's one point that we probably need to know with respect to, the global inflows of foreign investment that we are getting to see over the last 3 to 4 years. Foreign investments from a large number of countries, which are typically the capital exporting countries of the world, including from the G7, OECD, and even countries from East Asia and Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea, including Singapore. Now, there is a tendency for investments over the last 3 to 4 years, especially post COVID, to not follow a very broad-based pattern of taking entries into various economies, but there's an increasing concentration that we are getting to see. Number one, foreign investment is beginning to get concentrated, much as trade is getting concentrated among groups of countries which are politically aligned with each other. This is a clear trend that has emerged out of the available research that we have got. Secondly, foreign investment is also showing a tendency of concentrating among sectors. So, for example, if we look at foreign investment in manufacturing, within manufacturing, the majority of foreign investment is actually making its pick very carefully and very cautiously. So, in this regard, when we look at India, India clearly, in a large number of ways, has played its strategic part with the rest of the world in such a way that it doesn't get to be in a situation where it is being, turned away by the major capital exporting countries of the world, especially the United States and Europe and even from Asia. But when it comes to peaking industries, I think it is pretty much clear by now that investments will choose their industries, and investors, as far as long-term investment is concerned, is going to be very cautious. So, for example, we can't always necessarily expect to see a lot of investments coming into the area of pharmaceuticals and life sciences in a particular country, unless and until that country really has very supportive rules as far as intellectual property is concerned and does have a very capable infrastructure, which corresponds to health management, supports infrastructure, supports innovation, supports scientific growth, and also assures quality of healthcare. In India's case, if we put this question back into the context of the budget and go forward from what we have already discussed, that there are strategic sectors which have been identified for the budget. Semiconductors are there. AI drives are there. I think I would very specifically refer to a policy that has been announced by the budget, which I think is quite substantive in its scope. And you would have noted this policy that has been allowed with respect to provision of tax holidays until 2047 to foreign companies that are going to provide cloud services to global customers through India-based data center services. And along with that, there is also a safe harbor of 15% being provided to resident companies, which will supply cloud services to that first category of company which is going to use its capacities for serving global customers outside. Now, Iqbal, if we look at this in totality, we are looking at a tax holiday period of 21 years, effective from the date of announcement of this policy in the budget. And along with that, we are seeing several streamlining. Let us say, for example, clubbing of services under a single category of information services, increasing the safe harbor threshold for IT services. I think the strategic planning of the budget and the Indian industrial policy is to encourage the inflow of foreign investments in certain specific sectors, not all across the board. I think that is not the requirement, that is not the objective. So in India, we have seen there are global capability centers which are performing very well. They are now delivering digitally delivered services to a variety of clients across the world, including the majority of Fortune 500 companies and the clients they cater to across the world. India is among the fifth topmost economies of the world in export of digitally delivered services. And I think the thrust of the policies is actually in order to utilize the comparative advantages that India has already established and bring in investments from foreign investors, which will consolidate that advantage. So instead of rushing into schemes for attracting investors in building bridges and ports and maybe even in educations, I think there is a clear tendency to pull in investment in areas and industries where India can have that world-beating capacity. And I think to that extent, the kind of facilities that we are seeing being announced is actually very good. It's very robust. Ultimately, we will have to wait and watch to what extent this is going because, while we have seen the Alphabet and Google investing $15 billion in a state like Andhra Pradesh only the last year, we are also seeing these, rapid changes in the global investor sentiments. We just had the Anthropic announcing its latest AI product, which led to a huge decline in the share market as far as Indian tech companies are concerned because of the scare that AI tool will replace a lot of jobs that Indian IT professionals are doing, including coding and basic services. It's a very it's a very volatile situation, Iqbal, as far as the focusing of global investors are concerned. But I think when you look at long-term investments which are going to last in the economy, I don't think it's fair to expect that investors will come rushing into a number of sectors, 25, 30 sectors. No, investors are also picking their bets very carefully. And I think there are around 5 to 10 industries, especially for India, which can attract these investments. And the focus is to make investments come into those sectors.
Mr. Rai, would you agree with Amitendu's analysis? Do you see this budget as one that would spur private investment?
I totally agree with Amitendu because, to the extent possible, the government is trying to create uh, a picture of its being very reasonable in its approach, inviting in its approach, and creating the necessary environment to welcome investment. Now, the kind of see the kind of signals that they have been sending out seem to be encouraging because, for example, the dedicated rare earth corridor that was talked about, they have located these industries in states such as Odisha, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, and Tamil Nadu, which are strategic in terms of availability of sand and monazite, and also the fact that there are port related projects. And there also the government indication that they are giving is that it's not merely mining and extraction, but processing and refining, R&D, and advanced manufacturing such as rare earth to permanent magnets. So which means the government is indicating to any foreign investor wanting to set up industry that here is the entire gamut of activities that we are providing to you. We will help you locate it. And to that extent, I think the investor is looking to area or an economy which offers low inflation and where the government is not heavily indebted or leveraged over debt. So to that extent, I would feel that the signals that are being given out were, I think, more encouraging than had been given out previously. And that's why the government picked up these 4, 5, 6 strategic industries and said, these are the areas in which we are able to provide you all facilities. Not only that, the customs duties, the incentives, etc., over a period of time. And you come, set up shop, and these facilities will be there. These are all long-term provisions that are being made. So hopefully there will be some positive reaction to these encouragement that has been provided by the budget. But at the same time, I would hasten to add that one budget, an annual budget, is not sufficient to generate that kind of encouragement, which will have companies with deep pockets come and settle and set up industries, which would require, not only a sufficient capital, but a long gestation period. So to that extent, we have to wait and watch, and let's see what are the signals that the government will be sending out in the course of the year, number one. And number two, for any company that approaches them in the context of the encouragement that has been indicated by the budget.
Now, I know we're heading to the time where we have to start wrapping up the podcast, but it'd be remiss of me if we didn't get an opportunity to speak about the energy sector, which was spoken about a fair amount in the lead up to the budget, but also in the dealt with the budget as well. Now, my reading is that this is a budget that has focused on the issue of energy security and less so on climate adaptation. The focus is on developing domestic capacity in acquiring and processing critical minerals, building nuclear equipment, etc. What signals, Amitendu, if I could ask you, what signals are you getting from the budget about how India is approaching its energy basket, and if green transition is still an important priority?
Iqbal, I would look at this particular question from the perspective of certain policies which have already been announced prior to the budget. So let's say, for example, it's very clear now that India has made a conscious decision. One can call it a strategic switch or a strategic priority, whichever way, to actually work with the United States as a long-term energy partner. And to that extent, we had a deal which was announced in November 2025 about India, the Indian state-owned oil marketing companies buying around 2.2 million tons of LPG from the United States for the year 2026. In a very significant shift in policies, we have seen an amendment to the Civil Nuclear Supplier Liabilities Act that was passed by the Indian Parliament in December in terms of removal of supplier liabilities and capping the liability on operator, thresholds. Now, all these very clearly point to a direction where India is not only going to work closely with the United States as a long-term energy security partner, but also the fact that it is diversifying its choices as far as development of capacities in various sources of energy is concerned. So there's an effort to bring in more of gas. There's an effort to bring in more of the nuclear power. We already are aware of the investments that are going into solar and wind and a variety of renewables. But at the end of the day, Iqbal, the fact of the matter is that India is an economy which can't get away from its current different dependence on fossil fuels. So coal remains an important factor. And I think to that extent, there are a number of policies that I see in the budget. Which really, without undermining the importance of fossil fuels, is trying to give more encouragement to the growth of renewables. So let's say, for example, when we look at mostly from the trade side, and I was alluding to this earlier in terms of exemption of basic customs duties. So we have seen such exemptions coming for import of capital goods that are used in the manufacture of lithium ion cells. Then we have seen similar exemptions that are coming for imports of goods required for nuclear power projects till the year 2035. We have seen exclusion of entire value of biogas in central excise duty payable on biogas blended CNG. Again, capital goods required for processing of critical minerals in India, for those on import of sodium required for manufacturing solar glass. And finally, we have this fairly ambitious scheme. A big amount of investment has gone into adopting the carbon capture utilization and storage scheme, the CCUS scheme. Now, all these in a number of ways are important steps. And I totally agree with the thrust of these policies in terms of making imported inputs much more easily available for domestic energy manufacturers and producers in the country, because you were aware of that long debate which existed with respect to solar panels in India, between the domestic solar manufacturers and those who would want to import the cheaper solar panels from China. And the solar manufacturing is also an area which was within the scheme of the PLI support industries. Now, I would probably argue in that respect that this is a pragmatic policy, because this is a policy which is not shying away from imports. It is focusing on imports in the right sections and right directions, but it is also not demonstrating an import dependency. It is trying to walk a path between import dependency and import necessity, and not trying to complicate the priorities of developing domestic self-reliance, along with the absolute necessity of bringing in imports for supporting the growth of domestic industry. So that being said, one of the areas where probably I was expecting the budget to say a few more things, but I didn't actually hear that, is with respect to this challenge that India has begun facing in procurement of its crude oil. And as we know that the crude oil basket price for India is rising, but to what extent that might be mitigated through fiscal measures, or whether there are plans to that extent, have not been spelled out in the budget. So to me, this is a budget which is focused on energy, building energy security. But perhaps when it comes to immediate short-term responses, on the crude oil basket side, it could have been a little bit more explicit.
On that note, Mr. Rai, I'd like to give you the last word in this discussion. Mr. Rai, how do you rate the budget overall? And apart from giving your assessment of your budget, but also what are some of the challenges you feel that this budget could confront in the financial year ahead?
Iqbal, the challenges are huge. Despite the fact that we have signed an FTA with the EU and are on the cusp of having an agreement with the USA, also the challenges are huge. But I would rate the budget as taking a very realistic view of where we stand today and trying to send out the right kind of signals to the global investment people or the other governments that we are taking the necessary steps to ensure a good environment. We are trying to keep our own fiscal deficit and other things in control, in the sense that we are giving a growth orientation. There's a balancing of investment between public and private sector with sustainability. And the fact that we have been sending out signals to what Amitendu just alluded to in terms of carbon utilization and storage has been very substantially welcomed by certain industries that one has heard about. Because this is to reduce carbon footprint of some of our critical industries, as I mentioned earlier. We have no option but to go in for steel, cement, and chemicals, which are being exported to the European community. And we run up into the problems of the CBAM. But this is taking a step to encourage the capture and storage over long periods of time of carbon dioxide and convert it into useful chemicals to utilize them. Now, the technology, of course, was in existence in US and UK. It is very expensive, but the fact remains that the government has taken a first step in this direction to ensure, I'm sorry, that we are recognized for taking those steps, I think is good. And there I would rate it very high.
Thank you, Mr. Rai, for your thoughts on that. And Mr. Rai, you alluded to the sort of potential impact of the deal with trade deal with the US, and I have no doubt that that will be a topic of one of our future podcasts as well. Thank you, Mr. Rai. Thank you, Amitendu, for sharing your insights and perspectives on a complex and very important issue. I'm sure the conversation could have gone on longer, but I have to call the podcast to a close now. So thank you for joining me today. It's such a pleasure speaking with the two of you. And I'd also like to thank everybody who's listening in to our podcast. Do continue to tune in and to listen to the South Asia Chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Iqbal. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure joining in.